Welcome once again to My Connected Church, to our Saturday sessions for connecting. I am Charles Botts. I am the founder here, and I am grateful. For the opportunity to be back with you. I said a little earlier, to be back in the studio, so to speak. To be back in the studio. We were remote a couple weeks ago. Great venue, and I think we're going to have to do that again. We were out on the Connecticut River, Goodwin College's campus, here in our home in East Hartford, showing East Hartford remote locations a little love. So I think, we'll have to do that again. We'll have to scout out some locations and go live via remote broadcast. But it worked out. Got some pretty good feedback that some folks were enjoyed the change of venue, enjoyed the environment. So that was excellent, and excited to be able to do that. Last week we pre-recorded. Hopefully you had an opportunity to view last week's service. We continued the conversation. We continued the presentation on the church and the state. And part of last week was all about running down the history, if you will, of the Israelite nation, based on the prophetic vision, based on the prophetic dream that King Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, had, that Daniel interpreted. And if you recall, just as a brief recap, as a brief summary, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream and couldn't interpret it. And so first he started off by commissioning his soothsayers and enchanters and wizards and astrologers to not only interpret his dream, but to confirm their mysticism, their power, their influence, by first telling him what he dreamed and then providing the interpretation. As you could imagine, they could not. That power was not given them. And so as a result, the Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, outraged, was ready to just kill all of them, to kill every soothsayer, every wise man, every enchanter, every astrologer, every wizard in the kingdom. And while Daniel and his three comrades, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, while they were not wizards or enchanters, they were wise men. So they were part of the group. They were part of the category because they did play a role in the kingdom as wise men, as pupils that were going to then, based on Babylonian expansion and assimilation strategy, they were going to go back eventually to their home to acculturate the rest of the Jewish people to the Babylonian way, after having grown up in Babylon and raised in Babylon and learned of the culture. And so Daniel, having a connection with the head of the guard, got a 24-hour stay of execution, if you will, went before the Lord and was granted not only insight into what the dream was, what the actual dream that Nebuchadnezzar had, but also the interpretation. So he brings that. Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of a statue. The head was gold. The torso and arms were silver, or bronze, rather. They were bronze. The core and the thighs were iron. And then the legs, shins, and feet were a mixture of iron and clay. And these represented the empires that were going to essentially kind of control much of the world, certainly have dominion over the region. We looked at a couple of maps last week where we showed some examples. I'll pull one up really quick just for our benefit. So we took the opportunity to kind of illustrate just the mass expansion of some of these empires. I'll pull up Greece right now, because the Grecian kingdom and the Roman kingdom very similar. And so we looked at these regions, we looked at these territories, and we understood the prophecy that Daniel was sharing. And so you can see here very quickly, for all intents and purposes, I want to be very careful here, because the rest of the world was populated. It may have been kingdoms. There were entire empires in China happening during this time. There were inhabitants in North and South America. again, sparsely populated, but there were inhabitants in North and South America. There were inhabitants throughout the continent of Africa, south of kind of Egypt. This north western corner, if you will. So we want to be very careful when we say that these empires ruled the world, because there was a lot of world represented beyond these borders. This does, however, represent kind of the epicenter. At the time, the epicenter of the world, because this is where much of the world, the global population, was most densely inhabited. The population growth, the population explosion in China happened much later. The global expansion and disbursement of peoples happened much later. A large part of that as a result of a transatlantic travel, transatlantic exploration, and then ultimately we all are familiar with transatlantic slave trade, the kidnapping, stealing, and transplanting of peoples from this particular part of the world and throughout the eastern coast of Africa through the eastern part of the rest of the globe, specifically the Caribbean and North and South America. But again, here's just a map to kind of help us visualize where we were, to kind of ground ourselves when we're talking about this particular part of the world. We're not talking about the entire globe, but we are talking about the epicenter. We are talking about the epicenter. And so in Daniel's dream, when he talks about, sort of global or worldwide domination, these empires, we're talking about Babylon, the head of gold. We're talking about the Persian Empire, which is the bronze, the chest and the arms. We're talking about the Grecian Empire, Alexander the Great. That was the core and the thighs of iron. And then we're talking about the Roman Empire under the Caesars, and that's where you get the legs, the shins, and the feet of iron and clay, and what those materials symbolized. And so we discussed that and went into that, went into some detail regarding what they symbolized last week. And so, as we take the next phase, as we go to the next portion of the conversation, we want to evaluate and look at what were the impacts, what was the impact, the cultural, historical, political significance of these occupations, these various occupations. What kind of impact did they have on Israel? What kind of impact did they have on the Israelite nation, on the Jewish nation, on the Hebrew people? And in particular, as we begin to come to a more contemporary portion of the story, a more contemporary portion of the history of these people, I think it is important to set a framework for the kind of relationship God was trying to establish with the world through Israel, through the Jewish nation. Now, Charles, what are you getting at exactly? Where are we going with this? Well, keep in mind that God had established a relationship back in Eden. Humanity was created so that God would have a creation with which he could commune. He could have intimate, direct, personal relationship. And that was the role that humanity, through Adam and Eve, were to play, were to represent. And after the great fall, where humanity decided they were going to live life and frame their experience based on their standards as opposed to God's standards, that's essentially what the fall amounts to, is pursuing life and wisdom based on what we believe, what we perceive to be right and good, and abandoning God's standards of that behavior. And so after the fall, God does not give up on humanity. Even after the flood, clearly God has not given up on humanity, and selects a family, selects a specific group of people with whom he's going to reestablish this connection. He's going to reestablish his intimate relationship with humanity. And we looked at this in some detail when we started this work together a couple months ago during the series on righteousness and restorative justice. We examined the history and life of Abraham, and Abraham responded to the call. It was really Abraham's father that was the first to kind of respond to the call. His father was the one that left their home, left their place of influence, and began to emigrate to Canaan, to the land that God had established, the land that God had selected to build a nation, a nation that would then bring his relationship to the globe, that would bring his relationship, the desired relationship, to the rest of humanity. And so Abraham's father began the process but did not finish the work. And so that mantle fell to Abraham, and Abraham did proceed and made his way to Canaan. And so from Abraham, Abraham and Sarah give birth to Isaac. Isaac is the child of their promise. Even in their old age, God works a miracle, and they give birth to Isaac. And Isaac marries Rebekah, and Isaac and Rebekah give birth to two warring nations. Interesting side note here that Abraham begins to take his destiny, his legacy, into his own hands. And Abraham, you may be aware, his first child was actually not conceived with Sarah, his wife. His first child was conceived with Sarah's handmaid, Hagar. And Hagar gives birth to Ishmael. And Ishmael lives in their home and is a part of the family until Isaac is born. And Isaac is born, and there is some sibling rivalry. There is some contention. Isaac is born much later. Ishmael is 10 plus years older than Isaac, and starts to feel displaced and starts to feel his father's attention being pulled from him, and acts out. And so there is this sibling rivalry that's happening. Sarah takes action and essentially tells Abraham that Ishmael and his mother need to be kicked out. They need to go. They need to find themselves somewhere else. And now Isaac is married to Rebekah, and Isaac and Rebekah give birth to twins. And again, there's this rivalry, there's this conflict, Jacob and Esau. And without spending a lot of time going into that story, we recognize, we see that Jacob and Esau, there is a back and forth, there is a struggle for power, and eventually, Jacob takes the place of the older brother. He essentially removes his older brother from a place of influence by tricking him. And his mother, Rebekah, is in on it. And so together, Jacob and Rebekah supplant Esau as the oldest brother, as the heir to Isaac's promise. And from Jacob, we get more of that. So this contention, this struggle, is part of Israel's founding, Israel's very foundation. The 12 tribes that come from Jacob, eventually, Jacob conceives between his wives, Rachel and Leah, because Jacob is actually tricked. Jacob is deceived by his uncle Laban, with whom he's staying. And Jacob is deceived and expects to marry Rachel, whom he loves, and love at first sight, and something about a Rachel. I can relate to Jacob in that regard. Okay, stay on track. Got a little distracted thinking about Rachel. So Jacob goes to work for Laban, his uncle, to marry Rachel. Rachel is the one whom he loves, but Rachel is not the eldest daughter. Leah is the eldest daughter. And so Laban says, yeah, absolutely. Work for me for 7 years. I'll give you Rachel's hand in marriage. And essentially, when the marriage is consummated, the two are kept apart from each other, and Laban sends Leah in to the marriage tent to consummate the wedding, consummate the union, as opposed to Rachel. And so Jacob lays with Leah, and that kind of seals the deal, seals the bond. And so Jacob is now having to work another 7 years in order to be eligible to wed his first choice. And so between Rachel and Leah and their handmaids, so they each have handmaids. So between these four women, Jacob conceives the nation of Israel, 12 tribes. Jacob himself conceives 11 sons between the four women. And one of his sons, Joseph, we know Joseph, who was sold into slavery, Joseph, who was falsely accused, Joseph, who eventually climbs the ladder of leadership in Egypt. That Joseph gives birth to two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. And so the combination of Jacob's 10 sons minus Joseph, so the combination of Jacob's 10 sons and Joseph's 2 sons, you get the 12 tribes of Israel. And here God is building a relationship. Here God is trying to establish a connection with the world through this family, through these 12 tribes. And they are in Egypt, and they are prospering in Egypt, and they're proliferating in Egypt, and they're expanding in Egypt. And Pharaoh gets very nervous and tries to cut them off, and they're taken into captivity, and they're taken into slavery. And Moses, born from the nation of Israel, raised in Egypt, exiled, eventually returns to deliver Israel from captivity, marches Israel through 40 years of wilderness, and eventually to the doorstep of the promised land, where Joshua takes over and takes Israel into the promised land. And that is the land of Canaan. That is where their nationhood really begins, Now, what's interesting is, prior to this, God had a very direct connection with his people. He had a direct connection with Abraham. He had a direct connection with Isaac, a direct connection with Jacob, a direct connection with their wives. The Bible describes how Rachel, who was barren, who could not conceive of her own, pleaded with God, and God helped Rachel to conceive. And even prior to that, Rebekah, Isaac's wife, was barren and could not conceive, and God blessed her, and through her prayer and intercession. And so God is connecting with the parental unit. God is connecting with the families that form the nation of Israel. Israel grows and proliferates and expands. And as we go into the promised land, the journey of Exodus, the journey out of Egypt into the promised land, we begin to now see structure put in place. We begin to see God erect a culture, a society, a civilization, where Moses begins to establish positions. And so Moses has kind of the direct connection with God, but through God's leadership and through God's organizing, Moses establishes the office of the high priest. Moses establishes the position of the Levites that serve the tabernacle, that serve the place of God, the dwelling place of God. Moses establishes judges that would adjudicate issues, that would resolve challenges that came up among the people, that Moses didn't have the capacity to administer himself. We're talking about a nation. We're talking about thousands and thousands of people. We're talking about an expansive population. And so Moses is not in a position to hear every conflict, to adjudicate every issue. And so Moses establishes judges. And so you have the high priest, you have the Levites, and you have the judges. And so we're beginning to get a sense. And the judges were over groups of hundreds and groups of tens and groups of thousands. So the judges had, based on their kind of leadership acumen, based on giftings that God had given them, you had judges that administered, God's authority, God's decision making over various group sizes. So we're beginning to see a civilization form. We're beginning to see a civilization grow. We're beginning to see a civilization be established. And they move into the promised land. And the walls of Jericho come down. And they begin to expand and they begin to spread out. And each tribe gets its own land. And Nasser and Issachar and Gad and Simeon and Naphtali and Ephraim and Manasseh and on down. Benjamin and Judah, all the way down, so that each of the 12 tribes has its own territory. And so there's a civilization that God is forming. However, as Israel begins to establish its presence in the land promised to them, as Israel begins to establish its presence in Canaan, in this part of the world, they make a decision that changes everything. They make a decision that alters their course of history. As Moses passes off, there are priests. The priesthood is established in the line of Aaron. But as Moses passes off and Joshua steps into position, and as Joshua passes off, the position, the office of the prophet comes into being. The office of the prophet comes into being, and the prophet works with and kind of collaborates with the high priest. The high priest, if you will, is the religious authority that makes the sacrifices and administers the functioning of the tabernacle. It's the prophet that brings the word of God. It's the prophet that offers direction. And it's under the leadership of the prophet Solomon. Solomon, yes, you know that Solomon, whose mother Hannah could not conceive. And Hannah would go to the temple, and Hannah would plead and would beg God for a child, for a son. And Eli, the high priest at the time, would see her in such great travail and assume that she was drunk, and she wasn't drunk. As a matter of fact, she was just full of the Holy Spirit that was interceding on her behalf. Yeah, that Hannah, that mighty woman of God who dedicated her son before he was even conceived, before he was even born. Side note, parents, you have a responsibility. We have an obligation to put our children in the hands of God, to dedicate our children to God, to the service of God. It is our responsibility. If you're a single person, yes, talking to you. If you're a single person right now, and it's your desire to have a family, I want to challenge you. Begin to pray and dedicate those unborn children, those unconceived children to the service of God. I want to challenge you to take some time in your singlehood, in your singleness. I know you're praying for a spouse. I want you to pray for that spouse, but I want you to go a step further and begin to dedicate those children whom you haven't seen yet, whom you haven't conceived yet. You haven't even named them, but dedicate your children to the service of God. even in your singleness. Even in your singleness, dedicate your children to the service of God. This is what Hannah did. And Hannah dedicated Solomon. And after she nursed Solomon, she handed Solomon over to Eli the priest, where he was raised and grew up in the service of the Lord, in the service of the Lord. And it's Solomon who hears God's voice at a young age. And it's Solomon who speaks to God's people because of the connection that he has to God. And it was under Solomon's leadership that the 12 tribes, representatives from the 12 tribes, come and say, give us a king. Give us a king. God had established a society. God had established a culture. God had established a government. High priests, prophet, Levites, judges. And Israel comes to Solomon and says, we want to wipe all that out, and we want a king. We want a nation like the rest of the world. We want to be like everybody else. Israel, you were never called to be like everybody else. Children of God, you were never called to be like anyone else. Oh, Jesus. Listen, you are a peculiar people. You're a royal priesthood. You're a holy nation. You're meant to stand apart. You're meant to stand out. You were not called to conform to this world. You were not called to conform to the standards and the practices of this world. You're supposed to stand out. You're supposed to be different. You're supposed to be confusing to a world that does not understand how you operate, how you think, because you have a higher calling. You have a higher standard of living. You have a connection to the Creator God that does things different than the world. You're peculiar. You're strange. You're not meant to conform. You're not meant to look like everyone else. You're not meant to sound like everyone else. You're not meant to be like everyone else. You're supposed to be different. We're talking about the church and the state. The church was never meant to conform to the state. The church was always meant to stand apart as an example. The church was always meant to be set aside as a light on a hill, to be a standard to which the world was ascribed and striving to meet. The church was never meant to condescend, to bring itself down, to conform to the standards of the world. The world should be aspiring and striving to be more like the church. And Israel, in an attempt to be like anyone else and everyone else, wants to wipe out the government that God established and insert a king. And in so doing, they introduced a form of government that essentially led to their eventual captivity, imprisonment, and conquering by these foreign nations. It was the establishment of the king that led them away, because now the king is not subject to the high priest. Should be, is not subject to the prophet. Should be, but isn't. We see that contention happen immediately. When Saul, the first king of Israel, Saul wants to go to war. He can't find Solomon. Solomon is not approachable. And so Saul takes it upon himself to offer a sacrifice to God, not his job, not his role, to offer a sacrifice to God so that he can go to war. The sacrifice is not received. Israel is beaten poorly, and it is in that moment that Solomon prophesies that Samuel, I'm saying Solomon, y'all, Samuel is the priest. Samuel Solomon was David's son, the king that followed David. Samuel was the priest that brought about the position of king. Israel petitioned Samuel, Hannah gave birth to Samuel. My apology. I was saying Solomon, it just wasn't landing right. Samuel was the priest that brought about the king. And it was Samuel that prophesied to Saul when Saul made the sacrifice that he was not allowed to make. When Saul acted outside of his position, it was Samuel that prophesied to Saul and said, God has ripped the kingdom from you. God has taken the kingdom from you. And so David is next in line, and then following David is Solomon. David was a man after God's own heart. David did not introduce idolatry. David did a lot wrong, but David always honored God. Solomon did not. Solomon introduced idolatry into the nation of Israel. Not for the first time. We know that at Mount Sinai, when Moses went up to commune with the Lord and ultimately get the law that was part of establishing God's government for Israel, while Moses is getting the law, Israel is forming the golden calf. Literally, while God is giving the law to govern this nation, they are down at the bottom of a mountain forming and building an idol that they are going to worship and celebrate as the God that delivered them out of Egypt. So we know that the first king to really bring it in through the ungodly unions, the ungodly relationships that he engaged in, that God warned him about through his father David, not to engage in these kinds of relationships. Solomon does. Idolatry enters into the kingdom. God does not occupy Israel under Solomon's rule because of the promise God made to David. But when Solomon's son, Rehoboam, takes over the throne, eventually Israel does begin to be conquered and be occupied. And thus begins the up and down, the back and forward, this back and forward relationship with various occupying forces that are meant to get Israel back in line because they've fallen out of relationship with God, and they get back in right relationship with God for a time, and then they fall out of right relationship and they are occupied once again. And this back and forth happens, and that brings us to this part of the story where Daniel has this dream, and we discussed the four kingdoms that occupied Israel and took us through kind of the balance of the Old Testament. These forces, these nations that held Israel captive, we now come to the place where we have made it through the 400 years between the end of what would be considered the Old Testament, the beginning of what we would refer to as the New Testament, the end of Malachi the prophet, and the first account of Christ's life from Matthew. And that's about 400 years. And during that time, there's the Maccabean rebellion. What's powerful about the Maccabean rebellion is that it was the high priests that led the revolt. And it was the priest's sons that carried the revolt, including Judah Maccabeus, which meant Judah the hammer. Maccabean or Maccabee is the Grecian word for hammer. And it was the high priest's son, Judah, that really freed Israel and got Israel to another 100 years of independence before they were once again occupied. And this time they're occupied by Rome, and essentially it was the high priest that welcomed Rome in. It was the high priest that welcomed Rome in. And so now we have to consider the impact, and we have to look at some of the changes that resulted from this influence. And so there were four positions, there were four roles that were introduced to Israel as a result of these various occupations. And so God works in patterns. It should not surprise you, kind of four conquering nations: Babylon, Persia, Greek, and Rome. And so we have four positions that play a prominent role in the functioning of Israel. And so we're going to look at them much more closer: the rabbi, the scribe, the Pharisee, and the Sadducee. the rabbi. The rabbi was the teacher. The rabbi takes on essentially the role, the position of the high priest. Jesus was referred to by his followers as rabbi, called rabbi many times. And so the rabbi occupies the synagogue. Now, the synagogue essentially becomes the modern version of the temple. Through various occupations, the temple is destroyed. The temple is destroyed, it's rebuilt, it's destroyed again, it's rebuilt. And so the temple, in its various occupations, does not play as prominent a role as the synagogue. The synagogue is a much smaller facility, it's a much smaller building, and so the rabbi functions as the leader, as the teacher, in the place of influence. They were the teachers in the synagogues, and so if you would imagine that the rabbi is the teacher, the synagogues become almost like the schools. It is often transliterated as master. It could also mean teacher. Rabboni is another variation of the word rabbi. You may see the word Rabboni, very much the same thing. Jesus' disciples called him rabbi as a sign of their respects. And again, the rabbi really, for the most part, took the place of the priest as the religious authority. How did that happen? Because the role of the priest became very much a political position. The role of the priest lost its impact because the priest abused the position, and essentially it became a political role rather than a religious and a spiritual role. And so the rabbi, the teacher, comes in to fill that gap, to fill that void. So, many times it was the rabbi's interpretation of Scripture, it was the rabbi's teaching and understanding of Scripture that in some cases took on even more significance than the law, than the Scripture itself. And so that's an important point to make, because the rabbis had a very important role to play given that area of influence. The scribes were almost like lawyers. The scribes are almost like lawyers. They were writers. Script, we get the word script and scribe come from the same root word. And so they have a significant and important history. They were responsible for recording events. They were responsible for capturing events in history. The scribes were also responsible for making copies of the law, making copies of the Old Testament, the writings of the prophets, etc. The Torah. The scribes were responsible for copying that. So the scribes had a very, very important role to play. A role of great leadership and significance. They were often referred to as authorities when it came to the law because they spent so much time with it. They spent so much time transcribing it. And in the King James translation of Scripture, scribes were also sometimes called doctors or teachers of the law, kind of doctor of philosophy, or teachers of the law. They weren't necessarily specialists in civil law, but more religious law. Luke, we kind of refer to as a doctor. I think, there's some confusion, some debate. Was he a physician or was Luke more of a scribe? I tend to believe that the doctor there that we refer to, or the occupation that Luke had, was a scribe, where he was a writer, a copier and writer of the law. The Sadducees wanted to leave things as is in the new government. So the Sadducees had no desire for things to change. They wanted to maintain the status quo. They were essentially the aristocracy within Judaism. They were the individuals of influence in a fight for righteousness and restorative justice. Part of the fight is not only against those that are in authority, that have influence and power and are perpetuating a culture of marginalism, a culture of oppression of the poor, and keeping economic inequality. That's part of the fight. But part of the fight for righteousness and restorative justice is also against those that are among the marginalized population, but have had opportunity to pull themselves up a bit and want to maintain status quo because they've been able to attain a bit of influence, a bit of wealth, a bit of authority, if you could use that terminology. And so they are very much not part of the true power base, but they've gotten a little bit of a taste, and so their pen. So if you imagine a pen where the marginalized and the oppressed people are kept, there have been a handful that have had the opportunity to expand their pen, so to speak, lengthen their leash, so to speak, and they have an invested interest in keeping things as is because there's a perception they have rised above. They have been promoted. They've gained a degree of status because their leash has lengthened, because their pen has expanded. We know what those individuals look like in contemporary society. Those were the Sadducees. The Sadducees were essentially this new secularized descendants of the high priests, and so they were kind of identified and hand selected by the Roman occupation to have a degree of influence and authority, but they were by no stretch of the imagination considered equal with Rome. A lesser citizen in Rome was still considered more valuable and of greater influence than a Sadducee. And many folks live under that delusion today. And then finally, the Pharisees. The Pharisees they resisted foreign influence because they desired to maintain their autonomy and also their position of power. This was a position or a group of people that wanted to maintain the orthodoxy. They held to the traditions of the past, and so they resisted Jesus because he was threatening their power base. The word Pharisee in Hebrew is the verb to separate. The Pharisees originated when pressure was exerted under Greek occupation to conform, and so the Pharisees kind of come out of that movement and resist conforming, resist being absorbed into Grecian culture. And so Pharisees really began to blend patriotism, the Jewish nationhood, with religious devotion. And so at the time of Jesus, what's something that really started off very positive, because again, they're resisting the acculturation of foreign invaders. They're resisting the cultural influence of foreign entities. They're resisting that influence and trying to maintain their autonomy. But unfortunately, it devolved over time and essentially became this self-righteous group that was promoting tradition and formalism. And so Jesus comes on the scene and from their perspective threatens that, because he threatens their power, because Jesus is introducing a new approach to life and relationship to God. So there we have it, family. The rabbi, the scribe, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. And so we're starting to see the intersection. We're starting to see the relationship between the church and the state take on a contemporary pattern. Jesus came to introduce a new way, and really the new way was to return to what God tried to establish with Moses and Aaron, this idea that the church would be the example that the government would follow, and not that the church would be looking for influence and authority and power from the government. And Jesus is trying to get us to return to that model. And so next week we'll begin to discuss and begin to appreciate the navigating that Jesus had to do in introducing this message, giving kind of a modern Judaism at the time of Christ. You know, we've kind of come up now. We are in Roman occupation. We recognize now the role of the rabbi, the role of the scribe, the role of the Pharisee, the role of the Sadducee, so that when we start to look at Jesus's interaction with these groups, we'll have an appreciation for what he's trying to do, for the purpose that Jesus was trying to fulfill in interacting with these groups, and essentially the patterns he was trying to undo as a result of occupation up until this point.